Hey everybody, and welcome back to Rationally Speaking. Today we're going to do another bit of a reaction to a video. People have been sending us stuff to react to and to watch because it relates to REBT theory, so thank you for sending those across. This is something that we've seen quite a few times, haven't we, Stu, on LinkedIn and other social media places as something that's been pointed out as not only a really healthy mindset for performance, but also something that seems really, really tied to REBT.
Yeah, absolutely, and it's really nice to see how elite level athletes relate some of the REBT theory, possibly without knowing it as well. So it really gives this sort of lends itself credibility to REBT in the applied world.
Yeah, it's a good point, and it's probably worth saying that through these examples, I suppose what we're not saying is that this individual is using some form of REBT or has ever engaged with REBT in the past. It's just that some of this stuff is just occurring naturally, and some of the things that seem to be helping athletes to approach their performance and to deal with the performance environment does echo REBT, and I think it helps to explain that, to help people to understand how this occurs kind of in the wild, if you like. So we have this example of Jemima Montag. We'll play the video, then we'll kind of have a bit of a chat afterwards.
Jemima Montag, you are an Olympic bronze medalist. How does that sound?
That's crazy. I had a lot of belief. I had a good feeling this last week. I felt significantly more pressure this year because in Tokyo there were no spectators. Today there were about 30 family in Team Gem t-shirts yelling my name. And you want to do well for them because you know how excited they'll be. You want to show gratitude for the 15-year journey this has taken since Little Athletics. But it's a careful balance of wanting that medal but not needing it. It's really a nuanced difference. So not needing it for your own self-worth or feeling that people love you, but wanting it, saying like I'm willing to give this a crack and be tough, and if it doesn't happen, the sun will rise tomorrow, but let's give it a go.
What's your initial kind of reaction to that, Stu?
So there's loads to sort of harvest from that short clip. So here's my first one. I made a few notes, and was it like 20 seconds, right? And there's like 4 things I've written down. The first one I wrote there was that Jemima says, I have a lot of belief. So REBT is not about kind of indifference or about not having confidence in yourself. Here's an athlete that's gone into that competition saying, I think I can win this. I really believe that my resources are capable of overcoming this demand. Simply, I'm good enough to win this. So I guess the first thing that sort of struck me there was having this kind of preference of winning rather than a desperation or a robust, rigid need to win. It doesn't mean that I don't think I can do it. It's kind of not, it's not like a self-doubt. It's just, I don't need to validate myself by winning, which then goes on to my second note, which was here's a person that doesn't kind of place their self-worth on an external reward or some sort of external validation.
Yeah, that second point, we can get onto that. But I think, as you said there, there's 20-second clip, there's so much you can take from this. So if we stay on the point around wanting to rather than needing to, what's really nice about this example is you actually have an explicit verbalization of the difference between wanting to and needing to, and the importance of being nuanced. She even says the word nuance. There is a nuance. There is, this subtle difference between want to and need to. And I think we talk about. I know we spoke about the framework, and we've done a bit of a show on the framework on the GABC. What we also get here is kind of the G and the A in place. So, yes, here's the things I want to do. Here's the things on offer. This is the things I'm setting my targets towards. But friends and family here, there's a crowd here, there's pressure. But I'm going to have I'm going to process this event rationally anyway. And that's going to get me to where closer to where I need to be. So when we're using REBT, we're not trying to reduce pressure. There's nothing here that is about Jemima saying, well, it doesn't matter, forget it. Who cares? I'm not going to aim for that thing and that will alleviate the pressure. No, this is about wanting to succeed and wanting to attain those goals, recognizing there is pressure and there is importance, but being rational about how you approach that pressure. And I think that sometimes is a bit of a misconception about what we do, and a misconception about REBT, that in some way we're trying to take people's want for success away, and that can alleviate pressure. That would be changing the G. That's not really our bag. That is an option we can have, that we can move into if we want to, if we need to. But within REBT, the main focus is on, well, let's see those as reality and relatively fixed in this moment in time. That's your goal. Here's the adversity. Okay, what can I say to myself that helps me in that moment? And here we have a really nice use of want to rather than need to and have to.
One of the reasons I like this clip, Martin, is like you just mentioned there about pressure. I think this sort of like goes back to this Elysian view around consequences. So Ellis wasn't kind of driven by saying, right, I'm just going to eliminate all negative emotions. It was almost like the opposite. REBT is a very humanistic approach, and it acknowledges that as humans, we're going to experience negative emotions from time to time. So maybe anxiety that derives from pressure, for instance. And Jemima here clearly acknowledges that there's pressure there. She's saying she's got friends and family there. They want her to win. So there's kind of like this, I want to perform well because I have these people here supporting me. Plus, like for her own, goal-driven action, she wants to achieve the gold medal or a medal. But what she's saying here is like, I don't really want to eliminate that. That's like normal. And what's really important for me here is we talk about the GABC. If your goal is, I don't ever want to experience anything negative, I think you're kind of setting yourself up for failure a little bit. I don't think that's a really good goal to have, or an adaptive goal to have. And I think what REBT really focuses on is, okay, let's not contribute to existing negative emotions. So let's make the emotions that we have as healthy as possible, first and foremost. And second of all, let's not contribute to it. So by her, if she were to go into that with this rigid, robust demand of, I must win the gold medal. So now not only does she experience the pressure from friends and family and the fact that it's an Olympic final in the first place, she's now adding to her own kind of misery, if you like, or her own negative emotions by saying, and not only is all this going on, this pressure existing, I also have to win, which is completely fabricated, of course, because she absolutely doesn't. As she says, the sun will rise tomorrow.
Yeah. Well, just picking up on that, some of those points there, Stu, being able to separate those two things, the need to and the want to, is fundamentally important. And you talk about the emotion piece as part of this. I always think, and I always say to people, your first job is to not make things worse. Don't turn something that is difficult and demanding into something that is super distressing. And I think that's that functional versus dysfunctional. That's where that gap starts to become important. Yes, you're going into an important situation for you, and you're going to feel some emotion, you're going to feel some anxiety, but don't turn that into dysfunctional anxiety through how you process what's going on in front of you, through how you make meaning of that situation. If you're making that meaning irrationally, so you're being very extreme, rigid, then it's more likely that you're going to experience that dysfunctional anxiety. So again, it's that sometimes misconception that REBT, because of its links to Stoicism, big S Stoicism, that it's about being non-emotional. But no, this is about staying on the functional side as much as you possibly can through your self-narratives, through the way that you make meaning of what's happening in front of you and what's happened behind you.
I'm pleased you mentioned that sort of big S Stoicism as well, because if I want to put my kind of critical hat on, if you like, when I watched that clip, and I know that Ellis himself, he'd actually enjoyed this. We know that Ellis held workshops every Friday night in New York, and he invited people to kind of challenge the theory and to try to falsify the theory, which only ended up making it stronger, of course. So sort of playing a little bit of devil's advocate. Like at one point, Jemima says, the sun will rise tomorrow. So what would you say to someone that might say, well, it's kind of like nihilistic there? It's kind of this, well, it doesn't matter then because the sun's going to rise tomorrow, so it doesn't matter what I do today. What would perhaps the practitioner's response be to that claim?
Well, one of the things that we have in REBT is this idea of long-range hedonism. And I know we've spoken before, probably off camera, as it were, about hedonism as a principle and as an idea. But Ellis kind of came up with this idea of long-range hedonism. So it's about eudaimonia. It's about fulfillment long-term rather than just this next goal. So the decisions you make today and the actions you have today and the thoughts you have today will affect you in the future. And it's best to think of the future as a kind of a cascade of multiple yous, which are formed and shaped by the decisions you make now in this moment and in the next few moments. So what kind of future do you want to have? It's important to understand that there will be a tomorrow and the next day and the next day and the next day. And therefore, how you process things now and how you look after yourself and how you make decisions now will have an impact on who you become and what happens down the line. And I think that one of the things that helps us with is this long-range hedonism, but also the kind of refusal or the working against of instant gratification and this kind of desperation to achieve things now at the cost of my future self. So I think, to me, the comment of the sun will rise tomorrow, there's two things nested within that. One is kind of anti-awfulizing. It's not the end of the world, which is almost a mirror image of the sun will rise tomorrow. So there's the anti-awfulizing piece, but there's also the long-range hedonism piece around, well, because the sun will rise tomorrow, I actually need to make sure I can do this sustainably and healthily, and that I might have another goal that's relevant to me that's might even be outside the sporting context that I need to take care of. And I think that you don't want to sacrifice everything you are to your performance identity. And I think some of that is within there. We're reading a lot into this, aren't we? Because it's part of what we do. It's kind of what we're trying to do in these conversations. But that's the subtlety of language. I think when people say things, there are these concepts and ideas behind the content of those words, and that's what I take from that particular piece.
I guess I mentioned at the beginning, I sort of wrote down 3 or 4 things there. So there's so much I could go into there, and I really wanted to touch upon some other kind of maybe critical points around it, and perhaps what our response as REBT practitioners would be to those critical points. But I guess before we go on to that, like one of the points I put was around validation and self-worth. So what I quite like what Jemima does here is she does pick up this sort of like language nuance difference where she says, like, I really want to give it a crack. I want to be tough. Like, she wants to win the medal. This isn't her saying, I don't care, I'm indifferent about it. It's not going to make me feel sad if I, finish dead last or anything like that, because she probably would be disappointed.
Yeah.
But what she's saying is, like, it doesn't mean that someone's going to love me more or less. It doesn't mean that I'm a better or worse person based upon what I do today. And Ellis actually spoke about this quite a lot. And another point that I really like about Ellis's kind of work and theory around here is that there's almost like this scale between kind of here's this person that everything that they do is externally validated. And this is kind of like the problem with something like self-esteem, because you do something, it's not that you do something once and then, well, that's it now, I'm a great person. The next day, you got to do something again. The next week, you got to do something again. And you've got to continually externally validate yourself and try to find ways of doing that, which is rather draining and also unlikely, because no one succeeds or does brilliantly all the time. We're all fallible human beings. And then we have this kind of middle point where I think Ellis's words were like, it makes me smile when someone thinks like this, which is just me being here is like kind of like worthwhile. And like, I have worth as a person, and yes, I'll do good and bad things, and I'll fail and I'll succeed, and none of those contribute. Then, we've had discussions again off camera, Martin, where you've sort of gone even further and spoken about worth as, well, no one has worth. Do you want to just kind of share your thoughts around that? Because I found that really interesting.
It's interesting, but I think it's a bit controversial.
Okay.
And I think it's controversial because it forces you to contend with the idea that the idea of value and worth is kind of like a human construct, and isn't something that's intrinsic to us.
Mm.
The other issue I have around value and worth conversations is sort of like who decides who's got value and who's got worth, and what is that criteria. There can't be any criteria for value or worth of human beings. We simply exist. Now, we've made our world, very cognitive and conscious, and it's worked out for us, you could say. But in doing that, we've also got a lot of window dressing, a lot of things that maybe don't help us too much. And one of those things, to me, is the idea of human worth and value. And you have to be really careful, because what I'm not saying is some people are more worthwhile than others. I'm probably saying the exact opposite to the extreme end, that as human beings, we simply exist. We don't have intrinsic worth or value. Our worth and value is, if anything, we are valuable merely because we exist. But I'm going to the next extreme point, which is to even speak of human worth and value doesn't make any sense. The reality is we're here for lots of complicated reasons that are to do with biology and the environment and evolution. So that's not a value proposition, really. So one of the reasons this is important for REBT is because, as Jemima kind of intimates there, not tying your performance to self-worth becomes quite a big strength. So saying that it doesn't matter how I perform, it doesn't affect my self-worth. There's two ways you can have that. You can either say, I am worthwhile as a human being because I exist, and there's nothing I can do or you can do to change that worth. So I might fail. That doesn't mean I'm worth less. I might succeed. That doesn't mean to say I'm worth more. That's important because it stops you from self-depreciating. It stops you from falling off the end of the worth conversation and saying I'm completely worthless, I'm a failure, I'm a loser. It stops you from going to that place because you're simply saying there is no action or behaviour or thought that I could have that changes my worth because I'm worthwhile no matter what. Okay, that's the first application. The second application, if you take it to my extreme end, which is to speak of human worth and value isn't relevant. It's not accurate. The other way you can cut it is, well, I don't have any value or worth, so therefore there's nothing I can possibly do to change that worth because that worth doesn't exist. And that second position is very difficult because it makes people contend with the idea that we are just here and we exist and we don't have to speak of value and worth. The reason why it's difficult to contend with is because it might seem as if I'm saying that humans are worth nothing, so you can do what you want with them and it doesn't really matter and no one's got... That's not really what I'm saying. What I'm trying to say is to define a human being with some sort of value doesn't make any sense. We're too complex. We're constantly changing. Each of us is unique. That's part of being a human being. You can't attach a value to that, because once you attach a value to it, you then have to start to think about, well, what criteria do we have that equals that value? For example, I have a collection of books here. So these orange ones are, a collection of Freud books. Now, how much is that first book worth? Well, it depends. How do you value the content of the words within it? Maybe Freud signed it. Maybe it's a one of one, and that was the only edition ever released of that book. Maybe all the others have been destroyed, and it's the last surviving book. You then have to start coming up with criteria to value something, and I don't think humans fit into that category. I don't think you can look at a human being and have any criteria for worth or value. What you can do is rate and evaluate the content of their actions. So that thing you did there was a bad thing. Either based on morals, laws, ethics, those kinds of principles, the cultures that we live within, or based on the outcomes. Well, you did a thing and it didn't work out, so maybe the thing you did was bad. Maybe the thing you did was good. Success and failure, we can bring that into that. The thing that you did was successful. In that moment, you did a good job. It doesn't make you a success. In the same way that doing a bad job doesn't make you a failure. For two reasons, as I've, just want to outline again, for two reasons. One, either because you see yourself as being worthwhile merely because you exist, which could be true. My preferred position is the more extreme position of, it's because to speak of human value and worth doesn't make any sense. There's nothing you can do to increase or decrease your value or worth, because the idea of value or worth doesn't make any sense. What do you think, Stu? I mean, I've kind of waffled through that, and probably in the edit, I'll probably make it sound better for the listener.
No, I like it. Keep it like this, because I think this is what the. I think this is what the. Well, I was going to say listeners, but that's maybe overstating our popularity. We'll say listener. Like what the listener likes or appreciates here is that these are unscripted. These are conversations. I've totally put you on the spot there, which I appreciate. What I would add to that is, yes, you hold this view, but I guess Ellis is talking about this kind of scale because as he's kind of preaching this or advocating, I should say, this kind of like lack of inflexibility in our demands, he's also saying there's a flexibility in our views. So we can have this scale and saying like, well, it's not binary. It's not one or the other. You don't have to like kind of agree with that perspective or disagree with it. And there's nothing in between. There's this scale. So I think what Ellis is saying is, well, one, like we don't really have to value anything because as a make a global evaluation. Excuse me, is what I'm trying to say. We don't have to have a global evaluation because as human beings, as fallible human beings in our lives, we're going to do some really good things and really bad things. And I'm going to relate this back to Jemima in a moment for the listeners. And this kind of relates me back to the I task. So one of the things that Ellis was particularly kind of keen on was, it's part of the CBT family. That behaviour aspect is really important. So we might challenge some behaviours around that with some tasks. And I've done the I task quite a lot. Martin, you speak about the I task in your book, where we might say to someone, write down in within the letter I, put down like things you've done that are good, that you've been proud of, or that you think have been positive actions, like you said, morally, ethically, whatever, and then do the same on the other side of the page and fill that up with like bad ones. Now, a couple of things that I find is I've worked with athletes and sports people who depreciate a lot, and they might score really high on terms like, if I fail, I am a failure, or I am a loser, things like this. And yet to a person, they're much better at filling in the good things, first and foremost. So if anything, it's like, well, you have worth just because you're here because you do more good than bad. And then second of all, even though they find it easier to do the good, okay, you have a little bit of both. So we can't possibly define someone on this one action because, like, on what criteria are we using the bad over the good or the good over the bad? You just kind of exist and you'll continue to do good and bad throughout your life. Now, what does this mean for Jemima? Well, for me, this is about that behavioral aspect that I think sometimes goes missing when we look at the C in the framework, where we just look at the emotional aspects of it. So if her goal is to be happy and confident, etc., well, when she feels that pressure, if she goes in with that demand, I can't feel pressure, or I have to be happy, or I have to be confident, something like this. It's like, well, now, as soon as she feels that pressure that she's acknowledged, which of course is going to happen in any kind of elite sport, well, now, not only is that pressure existing and it's not going to go anywhere, by the way, she's probably now thinking, why am I feeling like this? I shouldn't be feeling like this. And it's like maximizing that distress. And the behavioral consequence of that might be a level of avoidance, for instance. Like, okay, so I don't want to approach this because this is distressing. This is kind of like an undesirable situation. And I guess that relates to the interdependent nature of the framework. So now, because I have this distress, it makes the situation appear more adverse than it actually is. And then you have the other side, which is I'm now less likely to meet my goal because I might be avoiding something, or I might be particularly tense. I might not communicate or strategize as much or as well as I could have if I were feeling calmer and a little bit more rational about it. So it's not about indifference. It's actually about acknowledging you want to succeed, and that's wonderful. But it's about, we don't have to place everything on it. And I think that is kind of the key message in Jemima's interview there.
Yeah, I think you're right, and I think you've crossed a lot of things there. We've got demands versus wants, demands versus preferences. We've got anti-awfulizing. We've got this idea of sort of unconditional acceptance. My self-worth doesn't depend on this performance. And you drew the nice analogy there of the big I, little I task. The big I, i.e. you, your whole self, is made up of successes, failures, good things, bad things, things that can't be categorized as good or bad, indifferent, if you like. So you're a kind of a complex human being. But there's a fourth thing here that Jemima goes on to say a little bit. And she talks about how the journey she's been on hasn't been without its challenges. So there's also a little bit of kind of frustration tolerance in there as well. So in this one clip, which is probably maybe 40 seconds long in the end, you actually get the four main beliefs of REBT. And obviously implied within that is this kind of cognitive mediation, is this GABC framework of, well, yes, there's pressure, but here's the things that I tell myself to make sure that I can achieve what I want to achieve and keep myself healthy, which she kind of goes on to say. So there is a lot in here, and it has helped us to kind of maybe explicate the theory a bit more. The last thing I wanted to talk about in relation to this, I think, was this anti-awfulizing piece. And we touched on it a little bit. We spoke about how Jemima says the sun will rise in the morning or something like that. Now, this is where we have to be really careful when we're working as practitioners, because you can come off a little bit flippantly if somebody's facing something really important to them, or they've experienced something that is not their ideal, not what they wanted, is inconvenient and undesirable. If you kind of start to say, well, look, it's not the end of the world. In REBT, when we're saying things like it's not terrible, it's not awful, it's not the end of the world, what we're not doing is reducing the badness of what's happened. We're saying, yes, it's bad. It could be really, really bad. But to what extent is it terrible? To what extent is it awful? To what extent is it literally the end of the world? So when we say things like it's not the end of the world in REBT, we mean that literally, because the person who believes that really believes that. They really believe that this just everything's going to come crashing down. In an emotional way, they believe it. It's really part of how they're processing what's happening to them. So this isn't a flippant, it's not the end of the world, move on. We're using those arguments with people that truly believe that when they fail, it's the end of the world. When they fail, it is the worst thing imaginable. We're applying that logic and evidence to people who have those beliefs. This isn't a flippant thing. I think that's really important, because if somebody comes to you with a problem and your response to that is, well, it might be really bad, but is it really terrible? Is it really awful? I think that can come off as a little bit unempathetic, and it can be problematic for the professional relationship that you got with the athlete you're working with. I would reserve those conversations for times when the emotion is less intense, things have simmered down a little bit. With things like awfulizing, it's awful, terrible, it's the end of the world, it's the worst thing imaginable, your better route is to go down the functional route and to actually validate what the person is experiencing and saying, but question whether this is the most functional way to perceive and process what's happening. So you might say, look, I completely understand how this is terrible and awful and, it's a catastrophe. But thinking of this in that way, is that going to allow you to move on from this? Functionally, is that going to allow you to be there for people who have maybe experienced the same things? Is it going to allow you to do what needs to be done in this moment to make sure it doesn't happen again, or to make sure you recover from this? So you're making appeal to function, and then afterwards you can then circle back and say, okay, well, look, when bad things happen, what's the evidence that it's the end of the world and it's terrible and it's awful? Is it logical to describe these things in such an extreme manner? You can do that afterwards. So we sometimes have to tread carefully and be nuanced in our utilisation of REBT when we're in that awfulizing, anti-awfulizing area. We are not kind of devalidating somebody's experience. We're just trying to help them to try to put things in balance and take perspective. Sometimes can happen in the moment, but if it's a really genuinely intense situation, it can happen afterwards.
Yeah, I think this is, I mean, there's a conversation there for another time and another episode of this podcast, perhaps. But Ellis talks about this, about how it's not just about the theory, it's about the application of theory. And I believe in his book with Wendy Dryden, the application of REBT, he talks about, well, some of the challenges that the practitioner might face is don't be too overly active directive. There needs to be an empathetic approach, a humanistic approach. At the same time, the practitioner can't be too overly concerned with being liked by the client. There's this balance to be struck where, okay, we are trying to help someone get better as opposed to just feeling better, at the same time acknowledging that their emotions are being somewhat restrictive from time to time.
100%. And I think you can damage that relationship quite badly if you're flippant around what somebody's experienced. And there is a flippancy about saying, well, it's not the end of the world.
Yeah.
What I want people to understand and take away from this is in REBT, when we say it's not the end of the world, we're saying that because the person that we're working with really believes that. So we're saying that literally. The words in REBT make a real impact, and REBT doesn't use abstraction unless it needs to. This is one of the things I like about REBT. It uses some abstraction. For example, the GABC is an abstraction. We take a lot of complicated content and we say, let's abstract it into the GABC. But when we look at the beliefs, they're very specifically defined. And the language around that is very specific. These aren't assumptions. These aren't rough estimates of what somebody might be thinking and feeling. We are working with them to really get to grips with, what are you telling yourself? What are these beliefs? What's the content? To what extent can we articulate them accurately so we can evaluate them and figure out what to do with them? So it's non-abstract. Obviously, language is abstract in its own right. But we need that, or else we wouldn't have psychotherapy. But REBT doesn't. It tries not to make too much of that content abstract. We can define things, we can codify things, we can articulate things, which means we can then work with them.
And I think that's what Jemima does really well in that clip about showing, well, the sun will rise tomorrow. That's not said in a flippant way, in a way that expresses indifference to her performance that day. It's saying, well, I would have been disappointed if I hadn't achieved what I had achieved, but I'm also thinking long term. I'm thinking about my long term well-being, my long term fulfillment, and appreciating that the outcome of that race that she had just performed that day didn't define her existence, her worth as a person.
Yeah. It's partly metaphor and it's partly literal.
Yeah.
Literally, the sun will rise tomorrow. So why is that helpful? Well, if we can get people to think more literally, then it means they're less likely to think in extreme and dogmatic ways, because the reality is nuanced. So if you can think more literally, then it means you can think in a more nuanced way. You can align what you believe with reality. The reality is the sun will rise tomorrow.
Yeah.
So I think we can talk about this for days, really, and I think it obviously opens up the entire canon of REBT in terms of beliefs, in terms of the GABC framework, in terms of long-range hedonism, in terms of unhealthy negative emotions and healthy negative emotions. These are the main constituent parts of REBT, and we can see them alive in these examples in the wild, in the real world. So maybe, Stu, now we've kind of outlined what we think of the video in that particular interview, if it's probably worth sort of rewatching. And then maybe listeners can start to see maybe what we're talking about and piece things together and maybe see that interview in a different way.
Feeling this last week, I felt significantly more pressured this year because in Tokyo there were no spectators. Today there were about 30 family in Team Gem t-shirts yelling my name, and you want to do well for them because you know how excited they'll be. You want to show gratitude for the 15-year journey this has taken since Little Athletics, but it's a careful balance of wanting that medal but not needing it. It's really a nuanced difference. So not needing it for your own self-worth or feeling that people love you, but wanting it, saying, yeah, like, I'm willing to give this a crack and be tough. And if it doesn't happen, the sun will rise tomorrow, but let's give it a go.
There would be so many young girls watching you right now back in Australia, possibly igniting their Olympic dream. What is your message to those young girls?
Play on is my message. I want them to know that this journey isn't without its challenges, particularly around the age of 16 and 17. I certainly questioned my place on the sporting field and whether I wanted to take it to this Olympic level. But the message is, it doesn't matter if you're doing sport for fun in your backyard with your girlfriends, or whether you want to take it to this Olympic medalist level. Sport is about community and a sense of belonging, making friends, looking after our physical and mental health, learning amazing life skills like dedication and leadership, which are all such great things for the next generation of women and girls. So play on in your own way, whatever suits you.
So yeah, I think, in those final bits there, which I certainly wanted to play, you start to get that long range heading, don't you? It's about looking after your mental health, and and I think hopefully people can, when they listen to that the second time, they can maybe see the bits and pieces that we've kind of outlined there. Mm-hmm. And as we've said before, look, you approach this with any theory and you're going to be able to pull things out. That's the nature of psychology. That's one of the things that makes it really interesting to talk about and debate. If you come at this from a self-efficacy theory perspective, you're going to pick out bits there that make sense from a theoretical point of view. Our job here is to kind of explicate the REBT in what we see. And I think that gives people, hopefully, quite a bit of insight into maybe how we would process that kind of thing through an REBT lens.
I agree. And I think hopefully the viewers will see here about how REBT just can naturally occur in the applied world. So it's one thing like having it on the page. REBT isn't something that was just kind of put on paper. It was something that evolved. It's iterative. It's developed over a series of decades, really, and questioning as well, and contemplation.
Yeah, 100%. And I think there's an element within REBT which is obviously very reality based, and it's reflected in the theory. And when we spoke about the history of REBT, we talked about how when Albert Ellis was developing REBT, he was using clients as stimulus material. They were saying things to him and he was going, okay, yeah, that's a good point. Maybe it is that way. And clients was saying to Ellis, well, sometimes the way that I speak to myself and the way that I think perpetuates my own problems. So this comes from reality. This isn't somebody's pet project that they wanted to thrust upon the world. They then tried to get, convenient, agreeable evidence in a biased way and try to figure out. As you said, we're constantly testing this theory. And in the papers that we write, particularly the applied papers, we note cases where REBT hasn't worked for that individual. We supply the data.
Yeah.
And if we have a case study with 5 individuals, one of those individuals it might not work for lots and lots of complicated reasons. Partly because the theory is flawed. Of course, it's flawed. It's a theory for humans, developed by humans. Human beings are flawed. The theory is flawed, but it's a good theory because we can test it. We can test it. We can falsify it. And part of this real world type stuff helps to do that. It helps to either support or falsify theory. And we can find support in there for REBT theory because the things that the individual is saying maps against that theory quite nicely. But somebody else might come out and say, no, for me, it's not enough wanting to succeed. You've got to demand, and that's really helped me. Fine. It's a broad thing, and there's lots of ways that we can make sense of that from an REBT perspective. So we'll continue to do these, and maybe we can pull out some examples where somebody's completely going against what the theory suggests, and we can have a conversation about that.
That's great, Matt. I think we've spoken for quite a long time about this one clip. I think it's easy to do so with this clip because it's such a wonderful example of REBT in action. And like you mentioned before, it opens up sort of that box of every element of the GABC framework, the interdependent nature of that framework. And also we've touched upon some of the delivery aspects, which I think we haven't really kind of delved into too much, but that's maybe one for another time.
So maybe next time we'll go to a different example and have a similar conversation.
That sounds good. And of course, we welcome anyone's comments and views. Please feel free to do that.
Yeah, as always, if you've seen things that you think would be relevant to our conversations, videos, pieces of media that you think might be worth talking about, please send them across, and we'll do our best to film a bit of a video around them.
Sounds good. Thanks, everyone.
See you, everybody.